The boy will choose eventually, one of the millionaires said with a confident smile. Kids always do. That was 10 minutes before the CEO's 8-year-old son walked past every wealthy man in the room and took my hand instead. I still remember the way people stared, not because I was important. I wasn't. I was a black school bus driver wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, standing near the back wall of a charity gala on the Chesapeake Bay. In my jacket pocket was a folded piece of paper from an old bus route logbook. At the time, I thought it was just another forgotten record from years ago. I was wrong. By sunrise the next morning, that small piece of paper would expose a secret that had been buried for years and force some very powerful people to answer questions they never expected to hear. Before I tell you how that happened, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if stories about fathers, dignity, and quiet courage mean something to you, stay with me. But to understand why that little boy chose me, you need to know who I was before that night. My name is Calvin Brooks, and for most of my adult life, I've driven a yellow school bus along the winding roads that trace the Chesapeake Bay. It's not the kind of job people brag about at dinner parties. Most mornings start before sunrise. Most afternoons end with muddy footprints on the floor and forgotten backpacks rolling around behind the seats. But I loved it. Kids have a way of reminding you what's important. They don't care how much money you make. They care whether you remember their favorite seat, whether you ask about their science project, whether you notice when they're having a bad day. I learned that a long time ago, every morning before work. I sat at the small kitchen table in our rented house with my son. Miles was 9 years old and completely obsessed with chess, not video games, not social media. Chess. The old wooden chess clock sitting between us had belonged to my father. The paint was chipped around the edges, and one of the buttons stuck sometimes, but Miles treated it like treasure. That clock had survived 3 generations of Brooks men. Most mornings, we'd play a quick game before school. That particular morning, Miles moved his knight across the board and grinned. "You're getting slower, Dad." "I'm getting older," I said. "Same thing." I laughed and shook my head. Moments like that mattered more than people realized. 6 years earlier, when my marriage ended, I thought I had failed at everything that mattered. There wasn't a dramatic fight, no scandal, no screaming, just 2 people who slowly became strangers. His mother moved to another state, and since then, it had mostly been the 2 of us. Some days were easier than others, but we made it work. After Miles left for school, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at my hands. The same hands that gripped a steering wheel for decades. The same hands that checked engines, changed tires, tightened bolts, and fixed broken bus doors during winter storms. The skin was rough. The knuckles carried old scars. I remember thinking something I hadn't admitted in a long time. Is this enough? Not enough money? Not enough success? Enough life? Enough purpose? Then I heard Miles upstairs looking for his backpack and complaining because he couldn't find his lucky chess piece. And just like that, the question disappeared. Because purpose wasn't something I was searching for. It was already living under my roof. That afternoon, after finishing my route, I was cleaning out the bus when my phone rang. The number wasn't familiar. I almost ignored it. Almost. "Mr. Brooks," a woman's voice asked. "Speaking. This is Eleanor Whitmore's office." I recognized the name immediately. Everyone in Maryland did. The CEO, the billionaire, the woman whose son had taken my hand in front of an entire ballroom. "We'd like to arrange a meeting." I stared out the windshield at the fading sunlight over the bay. Something in the woman's tone told me this wasn't a courtesy call. And for the first time since the gala, I had the feeling that the little boy's choice was about to change far more than my evening plans. The Whitmore estate sat on a stretch of waterfront property so beautiful it almost looked unreal. The driveway curved through rows of perfectly trimmed trees before opening toward a massive stone mansion overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. Boats rocked gently in private docks below the cliffs. Every window reflected the afternoon sun like polished glass. My entire neighborhood could have fit inside that front lawn. I parked my 12-year-old pickup truck near a line of luxury vehicles that probably cost more than my house. For a moment, I considered turning around. Then I remembered the little boy who had crossed an entire ballroom to take my hand. So I got out and walked toward the entrance. The first sign that I didn't belong came before I even reached the front door. A young man in a dark suit glanced at my truck, then at me. Without asking my name, he pointed toward a side entrance. Staff deliveries are around back. He wasn't rude. That was the part that stung. His voice carried the calm confidence of someone who believed he was helping. I smiled politely. "I'm here to see Ms. Whitmore." The confusion on his face lasted less than a second, but I saw it. He quickly apologized and directed me toward the main entrance. Nobody laughed, nobody insulted me. Yet somehow that made it worse. People don't always need words to tell you where they think you belong. Inside, the mansion felt less like a home and more like a museum. Original paintings covered the walls. A grand staircase rose toward a glass ceiling 3 stories above. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked untouched. An assistant escorted me into a sunlit office overlooking the bay. That was where I met Eleanor Whitmore properly for the first time. She stood beside the window, dressed in a navy business suit, reviewing documents on a tablet. She looked exactly like the kind of person whose decisions affected thousands of lives. Confident, controlled, sharp, but there was something else beneath the surface: exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, the kind that settles into someone's eyes after carrying grief for too long. She greeted me politely and thanked me for coming. Then, before either of us could say much more, the office door opened. A man in his 60s entered carrying a leather folder, tall, perfect posture. Silver hair, measured smile. "This is Howard Mercer," Eleanor said. "Our family attorney." Howard shook my hand. His grip was firm. His smile never quite reached his eyes. I couldn't explain why, but something about him immediately made me pay attention. Years of driving school buses had taught me a strange skill. You spend enough time watching people through mirrors, and you learn to notice tiny reactions. The reactions people think nobody sees. Howard seemed friendly, professional, helpful. Yet every time Eleanor mentioned her late husband, I noticed a brief tension in his expression. Just a flicker. Gone almost instantly. Most people would have missed it. I didn't. Before I could think much more about it, another voice interrupted us. "Mr. Brooks." I turned. Owen Whitmore stood in the doorway. The same boy from the gala. He wasn't smiling. He was studying me, almost like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Then he asked a question that made the entire room go quiet. "Do you remember the bus accident near Harbor Road 8 years ago?" The air seemed to leave the room. Eleanor looked surprised. Howard's smile disappeared for the first time. And suddenly, I had the feeling this meeting was never really about the gala at all. For a few seconds, nobody answered Owen's question. The silence felt heavier than any conversation we'd had so far. Eleanor looked from her son to me. "Sweetheart," she said gently. "Why are you asking about that?" Owen shrugged. "The bus accident." Then he looked directly at me. "Dad talked about it once." Howard Mercer adjusted the leather folder under his arm. It was a small movement, but I noticed it. The same way I noticed a student hiding a broken phone behind their back or a teenager trying to sneak food onto the bus. Tiny reactions matter, especially when people think nobody is paying attention. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Eleanor apologized for the strange interruption and asked if we could continue another day. I agreed. But by the time I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about Owen's question. Harbor Road, 8 years ago. Something about it felt familiar. That evening, after Miles went upstairs to finish homework, I unlocked an old storage cabinet in my garage. Inside were dozens of route records, maintenance reports, and logbooks from my years driving for the district. Most people would have thrown them away. I never did. School transportation runs on details: dates, stops, weather conditions, mileage, tiny things most people ignore. I spent nearly 2 hours flipping through old records before I found what I was looking for. Harbor Road, 8 years earlier, the week of the accident, the official report stated that a luxury SUV had crashed during heavy rain late at night. The driver, Eleanor Whitmore's husband, had died at the scene. Authorities ruled it an accident. Case closed, at least officially. I compared the report to the transportation records from that same week. At first, everything looked normal. Then I noticed something strange. One route number appeared twice. That shouldn't happen. Not on those logs. Every route carried a unique daily designation. Duplicate entries created scheduling conflicts. Drivers were trained to avoid mistakes like that. I checked again. Same result, a duplicated route number. The kind of detail nobody outside transportation would ever notice. The kind of detail that shouldn't exist. I pulled out additional records and started comparing dates. The more I looked, the stranger it became. One entire page appeared to be missing from a route logbook. Not damaged, not torn accidentally. Removed carefully, deliberately. I stared at the gap between two pages. Someone had taken the time to remove exactly one sheet without disturbing anything else. My first instinct was to call Eleanor, to tell her what I'd found, but I didn't. That was always my weakness. I avoided conflict whenever possible. If there was a difficult conversation waiting for me, I usually convinced myself it could wait one more day, then another, and another. So instead of calling, I put everything back into the box. I told myself I needed more information first, more proof, a better explanation. The truth was simpler. I didn't want to be the person who brought trouble into someone else's life, even if the trouble was already there. Around midnight, I returned to the garage one more time. I opened the logbook again and ran my fingers across the empty space where the missing page should have been. That's when I noticed something else. A faint indentation, almost invisible, like pressure marks left behind by someone writing on the page that used to sit above it. Machines don't lie. Paper doesn't either. Something here wasn't just broken, it was wrong, and I was starting to understand the difference. The next morning, I returned to the garage before sunrise. The bay was still covered in fog, and the only sound came from gulls somewhere out on the water. I spread the old logbooks across my workbench and turned on a desk lamp. The indentation I'd noticed the night before was still there. Faint. Almost invisible. Most people would have overlooked it, but years of reading handwritten route sheets had taught me something. Drivers leave pressure marks, especially when they're writing quickly. I grabbed a pencil and lightly shaded across a blank sheet placed over the damaged page beneath. Slowly, letters began to emerge, not complete words, fragments, numbers, partial notes, enough to tell me one important thing. The missing page hadn't been random. Someone had removed it because it contained information they didn't want anyone to see. My pulse quickened. I carefully compared the recovered markings against the remaining route records. A pattern started forming. One bus had been redirected on the same night as the Harbor Road accident. Officially, no route changes had occurred. Unofficially, somebody had altered the documentation afterward. That's when I noticed something else. A reference number, half visible, just enough to identify which driver originally completed the report. I knew the name. Retired now, living nearly an hour away. I drove out that afternoon and knocked on his door. The man stared at the old logbook for several seconds before speaking. I haven't seen one of these in years. His voice sounded uneasy. When I asked about Harbor Road, he became quiet. Very quiet. Then he told me something I wasn't expecting. The route change had been approved verbally, not by transportation officials, by a private attorney representing a wealthy family. My stomach tightened. Howard Mercer. I didn't have proof yet. But for the first time, I had a direction, a real one. That evening, Eleanor called unexpectedly. She wanted an update. I almost told her everything. Almost. Instead, I held back. Again. Part of me still hoped there was an innocent explanation. Part of me feared being wrong. After we hung up, I sat alone in the garage staring at the missing page gap. The longer I looked at it, the more I realized something uncomfortable. My silence wasn't protecting anyone. It was protecting me. Protecting me from conflict. Protecting me from responsibility. and that realization hurt more than I expected. If you've ever discovered something that felt important, but weren't sure whether speaking up would help or make everything worse, you probably understand exactly how I felt in that moment. Because sometimes, the hardest choice isn't finding the truth, it's deciding what to do with it. A few days later, I met Eleanor and Owen at the estate again. I brought the logbook. I wasn't planning to show everything yet. I just wanted to ask questions. Howard Mercer was already there. The moment his eyes landed on the old records under my arm, something changed. Just for an instant. His posture stiffened, his expression froze. Then the smile returned. Polished, professional, controlled. But I had spent too many years watching people through mirrors not to notice. He recognized the logbook, and more importantly, he knew exactly what might be missing from it. As I sat down across from him, I realized the missing page wasn't merely connected to the accident. It had been removed because it contained the one thing someone had spent 8 years trying to hide. That night, I brought the logbook home, not because I planned to keep working on it. At least that's what I told myself. The truth was I couldn't stop thinking about it. The missing page, Howard's reaction, Owen's question. All of it followed me through the front door and into the kitchen. Miles was already sitting at the table when I arrived. The old chess clock rested between us, one side slightly worn from years of use. The same clock my father had once placed in front of me. The same clock I hoped would someday belong to Miles. "You look distracted," he said. "I'm fine." "You always say that when you're not," I laughed quietly. Children notice more than adults give them credit for. We started a game. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The only sound came from the soft click of the clock buttons. Then Miles moved a bishop across the board and asked a question. A simple question, the kind only a child would ask. "Dad, yeah. If something is true, does it stay true even when people hide it?" My hand froze above a chess piece. I looked up. He wasn't talking about the investigation. He didn't even know the details. He had been reading a history book for school and was probably thinking about something completely unrelated. But the question landed exactly where it hurt. I stared at the board for several seconds before answering. "I think it does, even after a long time." "Yeah," Miles nodded. Then he pressed the chess clock and smiled. "Good. Otherwise, history would be impossible." I don't know why that moment affected me so much. Maybe because children have a way of cutting through excuses. Adults build complicated reasons for avoiding difficult choices. Children usually don't. Later that evening, after Miles went upstairs, I sat alone in the garage. The logbook lay open on my workbench. So did my phone. 3 times I picked it up, 3 times I put it back down. Call Eleanor. Tell her everything. No, wait until you're certain. Wait until you have more proof. Wait until you know exactly what happened. The excuses came easily, too easily. Then my phone rang. Howard Mercer. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. His voice sounded calm, friendly, professional. "Mr. Brooks, I wanted to thank you for your time the other day." "Of course." A brief silence followed. Then he continued. "Sometimes old records create confusion. Context gets lost over the years." There it was, not a threat, not exactly, but close enough. "I've learned that details matter," I replied. "Yes," Howard said softly. "They do." Another pause. Longer this time. Then he added something that stayed with me. "I'd hate to see unnecessary pain brought back into Mrs. Whitmore's life." When the call ended, I remained seated in the dark garage. The bay wind rattled the loose metal siding outside. For the first time, I understood what was really happening. Howard wasn't protecting Eleanor. He was protecting something else, something hidden behind 8 years of silence. And if I kept avoiding the truth because I was afraid of conflict, I wasn't helping anyone. I was becoming part of the silence. That realization felt heavier than anything I had discovered in the logbook. So I made a decision. The next morning, I would stop looking for reasons to wait and start looking for answers. Because somewhere behind that missing page was a truth somebody desperately wanted buried, and I was finally ready to dig. The answer came from a place I never expected. Not a lawyer, not a police report, not even the missing page itself. It came from an old transportation archive stored in a maintenance building scheduled for demolition. A retired supervisor remembered seeing duplicate records years ago and allowed me to review several boxes that had never been digitized. Most people would have considered them junk. To me, they were evidence. Hours passed before I found it. A duplicate routing authorization, not the missing page. Something better. A carbon copy dispatch record created on the same day. Unlike the official logbook, this copy had survived, and it told a very different story. According to the record, a school district vehicle had been redirected near Harbor Road on the night of the accident. That wasn't unusual by itself. What mattered was the timestamp. The vehicle had passed through the area nearly 40 minutes before Eleanor Whitmore's husband's fatal crash. 40 minutes. Enough time to witness something, enough time to document something, enough time for someone to realize the official version of events wasn't complete. I spent the rest of the day comparing records, weather reports, dispatch communications, maintenance logs. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. The crash had not happened where investigators originally believed it had. The vehicle had been moved, not far, but far enough to change the story, far enough to hide what really happened. When I finally brought the evidence to Eleanor, she sat silently for nearly a minute. Owen sat beside her, watching both of us. Neither interrupted, neither looked away. "This would mean the original investigation was wrong," Eleanor said quietly. "It means somebody wanted it to be wrong." For the first time since we'd met, she didn't challenge my conclusions. She simply listened. Then Howard Mercer entered the room. The moment he saw the documents on the table, his face lost color, only for a second. But it happened. And this time, everyone saw it. "What is this?" he asked. "A question," I replied. Howard picked up the dispatch record. His hands were steady, his eyes weren't. I noticed something then that I didn't say out loud. Not yet. Howard wasn't reacting like someone hearing surprising information. He was reacting like someone seeing something he hoped had disappeared forever. The room grew quiet. Finally, Eleanor asked the question nobody else wanted to ask. "Howard, did you know about this?" He didn't answer immediately. That silence told me more than any explanation could. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded older, tired. The accident report protected people, not justice, not truth, people. There was a difference. Over the next hour, the story emerged piece by piece. A witness had originally reported another vehicle leaving the area before the crash. The statement never reached the final file. The route records connected directly to that missing testimony. Someone had buried both, not for money, not for power, to protect the reputation of a respected public figure who had been involved that night. The revelation created a problem no one could ignore. If the truth became public, an innocent family's understanding of the past would shatter. If it remained hidden, the lie would continue. Neither option felt clean. Neither felt fair. Eleanor stared through the window toward the bay. Owen sat quietly beside her. And I found myself facing a question far bigger than any logbook. Some truths heal, some truths hurt, sometimes they do both. The evidence was finally clear. The mystery was no longer the problem. The real question was what we were willing to do with the truth now that we had found it. I barely slept that night. The evidence sat on my kitchen table. The copied dispatch record, the altered route information, the witness statement that had somehow vanished from the official file. For 8 years, pieces of the truth had been scattered across different places. Now they were finally sitting in front of me. And somehow that made everything harder, not easier. The next afternoon, Howard Mercer asked to meet privately. We sat on a quiet bench overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. No assistants, no witnesses, no Eleanor, just the two of us. For a long time, neither man spoke. The water moved gently beneath the docks. Seagulls drifted overhead. The whole scene felt peaceful, which made what came next even stranger. "You have a son," Howard finally said. I didn't answer. He already knew. "I've looked into you, Mr. Brooks." That wasn't surprising. People with resources always did. Howard folded his hands. "You're a good father. Still not a threat." Still not quite. Then he slid an envelope across the bench between us. I didn't touch it. "What's this bit a solution?" I already knew it wasn't. Howard explained that a private educational trust could be established immediately. Miles could attend any school he wanted, college expenses covered, future secured, no publicity, no conditions written on paper, just an understanding. The kind powerful people often called a compromise. The kind ordinary people usually recognized by a different name. I stared at the envelope for several seconds. The amount inside would have changed our lives. There was no point pretending otherwise. I thought about the rent, the repairs my truck needed, the college savings account that never seemed to grow fast enough. I thought about every sacrifice Miles and I had made. Then something unexpected entered my mind. Not money, not the investigation, the chess clock. That old wooden clock sitting on our kitchen table, 3 generations of hands pressing the same worn buttons. My father had given it to me because he believed character mattered more than convenience. At the time, I hadn't fully understood. Now I did. Howard watched me carefully, waiting. Maybe he thought I was calculating numbers. Maybe he thought everyone had a price. The truth was, I was thinking about what Miles would learn if I accepted, because children are always watching. Even when they aren't in the room, especially then. For years, I had told myself my biggest weakness was avoiding conflict, keeping the peace, waiting too long, hoping difficult situations would solve themselves. That flaw had already helped bury the truth for longer than it should have remained buried. I wasn't going to repeat the mistake. Without opening the envelope, I stood. Howard's expression changed. Not anger, disappointment. As if I had rejected an opportunity instead of a payoff. "I think we're done here," I said. "You don't understand the consequences." "No," I replied quietly. "I finally do." I left the envelope on the bench. The bay wind lifted one corner as I walked away. For the first time since this began, my decision felt completely clear. By choosing the truth, I wasn't guaranteeing a happy ending. I wasn't even guaranteeing justice. I was simply refusing to become part of the lie. And once that choice was made, everything else began moving forward, whether any of us were ready or not. 3 days later, the Whitmore Foundation held a private board meeting. Officially, it was scheduled to discuss future projects. Unofficially, everyone in the room knew why they were there. The evidence had been reviewed. Independent investigators had examined the records. Former transportation employees had been interviewed. The missing witness statement had been located through archived correspondence. Piece by piece, the story Howard Mercer had protected for 8 years finally came apart. I sat quietly near the back of the room, exactly where I preferred to be. The board members weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at the documents spread across the conference table. For once, I didn't have to convince anyone. The truth was doing the work itself. Howard sat at the far end of the room. He looked older than I remembered. Not defeated, just tired. Like someone who had spent years carrying a weight that had finally become impossible to hold. When the final report was presented, nobody raised their voice. Nobody accused him dramatically. There was no television courtroom moment, just facts, carefully organized facts. The hidden witness statement, the altered route records, the missing page. The evidence showed that Howard had knowingly helped suppress information connected to the accident investigation, not because he profited, not because he wanted power, but because he believed protecting a respected public figure would spare multiple families from pain. The intention may have been complicated. The result wasn't. The truth had been buried, and now it wasn't. Howard eventually stood. For a moment, I thought he might argue. Instead, he simply nodded. Then he walked out of the room without saying another word. The silence he left behind felt heavier than any speech could have. Across the table, Eleanor stared at the bay outside the conference room windows. I could see the conflict in her face. Part of her wanted answers. Part of her was grieving all over again, because sometimes learning the truth means losing the version of the past that helped you survive. Then something happened that I will never forget. The meeting ended. People began standing. Conversations started. Chairs moved, and Owen quietly left his seat. Several wealthy donors were gathered near the doorway. Business leaders, investors, men whose names appeared on buildings. Owen walked right past every one of them, just like he had at the gala. Then he crossed the room and stopped beside me. I remember everyone watching, nobody speaking, the room gradually falling silent. Owen looked up at me and took my hand, the same way he had the first night. "This is him," he said. Nobody understood. So he explained. "When Dad died, everybody told me what I should feel." His voice was calm. Everybody except him. He squeezed my hand. He never acted like I was broken. The room stayed completely silent. Not because of me, because of the honesty only a child can bring into a room. At that moment, no title mattered, no amount of money mattered, no reputation mattered, only the truth. And somehow, the person who recognized that first had been an 8-year-old boy. As people slowly began leaving the room, Eleanor approached me. There were tears in her eyes, not dramatic tears, real ones, the kind people don't plan. She looked at me for several seconds before speaking. Then she said something I never expected to hear. "Thank you for giving my son something none of us realized he needed." And somehow, that meant more than any public recognition ever could. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after that meeting. Real life rarely works that way. There were still questions to answer, still reporters calling, still people trying to understand how a forgotten bus route logbook had reopened a story everyone believed was finished. But something important had changed. The weight of the silence was gone. A month later, Eleanor invited Miles and me back to the Whitmore estate. This time, it felt different. Not because the mansion had changed, because the people inside it had. The meeting took place in a smaller room overlooking the water. No board members, no attorneys, no cameras, just Eleanor, Owen, Miles, and me. On the wall hung a framed display that immediately caught my attention. Inside the frame was the recovered dispatch record, the document that had started everything, the surviving piece of evidence that helped uncover the truth. Beneath it sat a small plaque, not celebrating a victory, not naming a hero, simply honoring the importance of honesty and accountability. I stood there quietly for a long moment. Then Eleanor explained why she had invited us. The Whitmore Foundation was launching a new community program focused on student transportation safety and public record transparency. The project would carry her late husband's name, not to preserve a false story, to acknowledge the complete one, the mistakes, the truth, and the lessons that came afterward. That mattered. Because healing built on truth lasts longer than healing built on denial. Later that afternoon, Owen and Miles disappeared outside to throw a football near the shoreline. For the first time, they looked like ordinary kids, not children connected by tragedy, just children. That might have been my favorite part of the entire day. As the sun began setting over the Chesapeake Bay, Miles and I sat alone near the water. The old chess clock rested beside us on a wooden picnic table. He had insisted on bringing it. The worn buttons reflected the orange light of the evening sky. Miles looked out toward the horizon for a while before speaking. "Do you think Grandpa would have done the same thing?" I smiled. "I hope so. Me too." We sat quietly after that, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. The good kind. Before leaving, I walked back inside the estate one final time. I paused in front of the framed dispatch record. The piece of paper looked surprisingly small behind the glass. 8 years of secrets, 8 years of pain, 8 years of unanswered questions. and in the end, part of the truth had survived because someone forgot to destroy a single record. I touched the frame gently, then turned away. Not because the story no longer mattered, because it finally belonged where it should have been, in the open. As Miles and I drove home along the bay, the sunset painted the water gold. My son sat beside me. The road stretched ahead, and for the first time in a very long while, neither of us was carrying something that needed to stay hidden. If this story stayed with you, I'd like to ask you something. Have you ever found yourself standing at a crossroads between comfort and truth? Have you ever known that doing the right thing might cost you something important? Maybe you've discovered that the hardest decisions aren't about money at all. Maybe they're about the kind of example you're leaving behind for the people who are watching you every day. For me, that person was my son. And maybe for you, it's a child, a grandchild, a friend, or someone who quietly learns from the choices you make. If you've ever experienced a moment when one small detail changed everything, share your story in the comments. I'd love to read it. And if this story reminded you that dignity, honesty, and courage still matter, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Until next time, take care of the people you love. They're learning far more from your actions than your words.